Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Sri Lanka is in the midst of an economic freefall. The government is low on foreign exchange reserves and struggling to pay off debts. The Sri Lankan rupee has plunged in value over the last several weeks. Inflation is soaring, fuel is scarce, and there have been widespread blackouts in major parts of the country. This sharp economic downturn is sparking a political crisis for the long-ruling Rajapaksa family. The current president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was the defense minister for his older brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who served as president from 2005 to 2019. In 2019, Gotabaya became president and Mahinda became prime minister. Meanwhile, other members of this family have served in various other top government posts. But now, widespread protests are posing the most significant challenge to this family's grip on power in decades. My guest today, J.S. Tissanayagram, is a Sri Lankan journalist and human rights activist living in the U.S. He kicks off explaining how this economic crisis is impacting the daily lives of three women who are of different ethnicities and social classes. We then have a longer discussion about the causes of this economic crisis and its potential political impact. One thing to emphasize, as J.S. Tissanayagram does in this conversation, is that the Rajapaksa's grip on power is rooted in a kind of ethno-nationalism that supports the supremacy of the Sinhala Buddhist majority over the Tamil and Muslim minorities in the country. This is one key political backdrop to understand as this crisis challenges the Rajapaksas going forward. It was great to have J.S. Tissanayagram back on the podcast. We last spoke a year ago about how COVID-19 restrictions were being used as a pretext for government crackdowns on ethnic and religious minorities in the country, specifically the Tamil and Muslim populations. And today's conversation does a really good job of explaining the political and economic roots of this current crisis unfolding in Sri Lanka. All right, now here is my conversation with J.S. Tissanayagram.
Sri Lanka's problem today stems basically from a failure of accountability when wrong decisions are made. This has led to both an economic crisis as well as a political crisis. At the same time, the failure is systemic. The economic crisis is not affecting everyone equally. So I have a couple of examples. One example is Chandramati, who is a Tamil living in Kilinochchi, in the northern part of Sri Lanka, as a mother of a boy who was forcibly disappeared by the Sri Lanka government. She's a teacher. Like her southern counterparts, she and her family too are facing shortages of cooking gas, fuel, electricity, etc. However, she says because the government limiting food and fuel in the past, during Sri Lanka's 26-year civil war, she can bear these privations. Her main concern for the last 13 years has been searching for her son who disappeared. She says Tamil families protesting every day for the last 5 years for their disappeared loved ones have not had accountability or justice, despite different political parties and leaders being in government. Then another example is Shirali, who is also a teacher living in the outskirts of Colombo, that is Sri Lanka's capital city. A Sinhalese mother, she has 3 children under the age of 10. The 13-hour power cuts in late March were especially hard on her because none of her children would sleep due to the heat. She could not teach online because each part of Colombo had different power cut schedules. Now that the 13-hour power cuts have been done away with, things are easier. But she still finds it difficult to go to work because there are fuel shortages and her husband and she had to take turns in being in line to obtain a canister of cooking gas that would last them for about 3 weeks. Finally, there is Iromi. Iromi is a vice president of a conglomerate. She is the mother of 2 and lives in the most affluent part of Colombo, Cinnamon Gardens, known as Colombo 7. She's worried about her business. The value of the Sri Lankan currency plunging. She wonders if she could even make modest profits this year. She hopes the government agreeing to the IMF program, even at this stage, will stabilize the economy. Personally, she has not been affected as the others because Colombo 7 does not have daily power cuts. Her children can study online and she can work from home. And her maid ensures that there is cooking gas to cook food. So when we are speaking about the economic crisis, it hasn't affected everyone equally or in the same way.
But it has affected everyone, but as you said, not equally. I mean, the plunging value of the Sri Lankan rupee is sort of stunning to behold. It is the worst performing currency in the world today, including like the Russian ruble. It's really sort of shocking to see a currency be devalued so quickly.
So the main economic problem, the crisis besetting Sri Lanka, has been two issues. One has been budget deficits and the current account deficit. When Sri Lanka's civil war ended in May 2009, there was hope in a substantive peace dividend. However, that didn't quite materialize, except of course in the expansion of tourism. Sri Lanka therefore had to resort to international borrowing. It started borrowing from international capital markets, but soon turned to government loans, especially from China. Sri Lanka had to also borrow from India and Western countries. All this increased budget deficits. Sri Lanka tried to service these debts from income earned from tourism, foreign remittances, supplemented, of course, by exports of tea, etc. Although there was always a current account deficit, because the import of oil, food, medicine, and retail products exceeded the income from exports. Then a couple of things happened in 2019 and 2020. First, Gotabaya Rajapaksa became president and went on to implement two ill-advised policies. The first was to slash taxes, including VAT, or the value-added tax, by almost half. So there was a substantial drop in revenue from that. Secondly, he implemented an abrupt switch from chemical fertilizer to organic fertilizer. This led to a huge fall in yields, affecting food security and a further fall of revenue.
Can I stop you there? Because that seems like quirky. Why impose that restriction?
No one knows for sure, actually. But one of the reasons that they have been that is stated at that time was that chemical fertilizer was not good for the environment. It was not good for health, and that it was affecting people's health and well-being. And therefore, he was hoping that he was shifting, or his government was hoping to shift from chemical fertilizer to organic fertilizer. But the problem here was this: the shift was immediate and abrupt. And the soil in Sri Lanka, which was used, or the farmers who were used to cultivating using chemical fertilizer, couldn't make the abrupt change because the soil wasn't used to it. And it led to an immediate drop in yields, both for, say, paddy, which is Sri Lanka's staple food supply, as well as things like tea and so on and so forth, which is an important foreign exchange earner. So the real reason for that, we do not know, except perhaps the reason of health and trying to keep foreign exchange from going out. But it had a disastrous consequence on the people and on the economy.
So you had the tax cuts combined with this desire or imposition of switching the kind of fertilizers are used in Sri Lanka, which led to a sharp reduction in the production of key exports like tea, combined, I suppose, then a year later with the pandemic, right? That
Right.
presumably had a huge impact on Sri Lanka's tourism industry, among others, which you said was responsible for some of the revenue generated to pay off some of these foreign debts.
Right. Yeah. So then the pandemic happened. Almost overnight, it affected Sri Lanka's foreign earnings because foreign tourists stopped coming. Garment exports contracted because there were few foreign orders. Remittances by overseas workers dried up because workers had to return to Sri Lanka. Therefore, the real crisis arose because as international debt could not be paid off, because of foreign earnings. While Sri Lanka wrestled with repaying foreign debt, it had to also import essentials like fuel, cooking gas, food, and pharmaceuticals. In desperation, Sri Lanka began dipping into its foreign exchange reserve. Problems of repaying debt, peculiar to Sri Lanka, of course, was exacerbated by international crises faced by other nations as well, such as supply chain shortcomings, and with the Russia-Ukraine war, rise in international oil prices. With shortages and domestic demand rising, prices soared, and the government started printing money, which aggravated inflation. This devalued the domestic currency, the rupee that is, and making it more difficult for Sri Lanka to meet its debt obligations in US dollars. With limited fuel, long lines for fuel, for vehicle gas, cooking gas, and the worst thing was 13-hour power cuts began, which in turn started the protests of the people against what was going on.
Here where I want to pick up the story. As we speak, there have been days or more of protests throughout Sri Lanka, including at the residence of the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Can you describe these protests in more detail?
Right. Well, what was surprising about the present crisis is that Sri Lankans took to the streets in protest. What was sporadic, say in early March, became more widespread as time went on. The main reason for these protests, of course, was economic shortages of food, fuel, cooking gas, medicine, etc. And most important, electricity cuts up to 12 hours a day, which began to hit the middle class very badly. But inevitably, the protests became politicized with the call for Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign, or the Go Home Gota slogan. But due to the Rajapaksa family controlling the government in many ways, the rising anger against them became Go Home Rajapaksa.
So not just Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but the whole Rajapaksa ruling clan is being turned upon by the Sinhalese majority population that they sought to cultivate for many, many years.
Yes, that is correct. It has been mostly Sinhalese, but there have been also Muslims and Tamils participating in these protests. Although the Tamils have had different slogans. It's not only Go Home Gota, they have had other slogans as well, which I can explain as we go along.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, despite the protests at the Golface Promenade, which is in downtown Colombo, and that has featured prominently in the news, I believe that by itself, it is not powerful enough to make either President Gotabaya Rajapaksa or the Rajapaksa clan give up power. Those protests do not have a political program other than for the president and his relatives to leave government. The protests have become popular because it is largely fueled by the middle class, which thinks that it is part of a political revolution, amplified through social media. The protest in Golface Promenade, therefore, is, to my mind, a group of people under an authoritarian regime making the best use of an opportunity to hurl abuse at the president, his family, and the government. However, there have been other groups agitating for change, such as the Ceylon Teachers Union, there's the railway union that is calling for a strike, there's the opposition political party, the JVP, and the main opposition party, the SJP, that have all mobilized and are being taken much more seriously by the regime because they actually have a political program.
What has been the response thus far of the Rajapaksas to this protest movement?
its response is not to go away or to resign, or Gotabaya Rajapaksa to remain to resign and go away, unless, of course, he faces much more political opposition. Under the circumstances, the idea that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is going to resign and go home is misled. And why is that? Because if he relinquishes power, he cannot live in Sri Lanka, as his singular enemies will want to punish him and could use the Sri Lankan courts to mete out punishment. And it is well known that he is terrified of the courts of law, let alone imprisonment. If Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigns and moves overseas, to say the US, there will be, where he has property and family, the Tamil diaspora and human rights defenders who have filed cases against him for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity will be waiting to resume proceedings, which is also something that terrifies him. Unless, of course, he is given immunity, which is never a 100% guarantee. Therefore, resigning is the last thing on his mind. So now that Sri Lanka has engaged in a program with the International Monetary Fund to restructure the repayment of its debt, Gotabaya Rajapaksa realizes Sri Lanka in the next few months or years is going to face painful austerity. Therefore, to spread the responsibility of the pain with as many parties as possible might be the best fight. Therefore, he is happy to have a multi-party government. At the head of the government, he will want to project himself, a singular Buddhist, as a strong leader. He would want to project himself as the man who ensures political stability in a world where there is inevitable unrest because of austerity and shortage. Meanwhile, he will also transmit the message that as a former soldier and defense secretary, that he has the confidence of the military to ensure there is no coup. So he will want to project himself as a strong leader in whom the international community can retain confidence. Such a leader will be palatable to Washington, which likes stability and will also hope to use the IMF debt restructuring program and other economic ties to wean Colombo out of China's economic grip. And also, the US would like to use Gotabaya to strengthen military relations, such as resume negotiations on the status of forces or SOFA agreement, which has been in limbo. So my feeling is that he's not resigning in his suit.
He'll try to kind of weather this storm in the ways that you describe. So earlier in our conversation, you cited lack of accountability as one of the reasons that Sri Lanka's economy is in the mess that it's in today. Presumably, this refers, at least in part, to the credible accusations of war crimes and crimes against humanity leveled against Gotabaya Rajapaksa, stemming from the end of the Sri Lankan civil war in May 2009, in which, I've seen estimates of around 40,000 Tamils were basically murdered by the Sri Lankan military, then headed by Gotabaya, who is now the president of Sri Lanka. To what extent can you sort of draw a straight line between that event, the kind of ethno-nationalism that the Rajapaksas invoked to sustain their rule, and the economic crisis of today?
Right. So that is why I call the failure of accountability on economic issues systemic, and not only something to do with economics and what has transpired in the last couple of months. Because an important example of this systemic failure is that Sri Lanka's political leaders, including Gotabaya Rajapaksa, as he was saying, and serving military top brass, were not held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed against the Tamils during the country's civil war. The judicial system and the media, which are built-in guardrails against criminal behavior by governments, fail to bring about that accountability. And not being accountable for war crimes is to me a serious failure of the system, as today's economic crisis, because not only does it reflect that the institutions of justice were unable to punish criminal behavior, but that the failure of Sri Lanka's constitution to guarantee equality, non-discrimination, and human rights for all its citizens, because that was the failure that brought about the civil war in the first place. So there is a direct line in the fact that Sri Lanka's institutions have not been able to be accountable for criminal behavior by governments, as well as other shortcomings such as bad policy decisions, which brought about this economic crisis, which Sri Lanka is now experiencing.
Going forward, in the next few days or weeks or even months, what will you be looking towards that will suggest to you how this crisis may unfold, both politically and economically?
I feel that there are four possibilities. There are four possibilities. One of which I described. So I will restate the four possibilities. I won't go through the possibility that I just described, but I'll go through the other three possibilities. So the four possibilities are: one, Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigns and goes home, which I said will not happen. So I will not repeat that. The other possibility, the second possibility, is that the SJB, which is the main opposition party, establishes a parliamentary government, but its policies being such will ignore Tamil and Muslim issues. The third possibility is that the Tamil political parties use this moment to push for restructuring the state and sharing power under a federal government. And of course, the fourth possibility is that Gotabaya Rajapaksa abandons all political negotiations and rules with the military support. So I'll try to go into a bit of detail about the second, third, and fourth issue. So the main opposition, the second possibility, of course, is the main party in opposition, the SJB, trying to use the opportunity of political unrest to probably retain Gotabaya Rajapaksa as the nominal head of state or as president, but bring about changes to make parliament the center of political power. The SJB leadership will try, and they have made certain pronouncements or come up with a draft that reflects their interest in these changes. The SJB's leadership will try to portray itself as being more pro neoliberal reform than the present government, and therefore better able to manage the IMF program. However, Parliament becoming the locus of power under this arrangement will be at the expense of the Tamils and Muslims. Tamils and Muslims have been demanding that Sinhala Buddhists who dominate the state share power with them. There is nothing in the program put forward by the SJB that says that it is willing to share any more power than what the present constitution shares with the Tamils and Muslims, which both the Tamils and Muslims have rejected as inadequate. The SJB will try to appeal to the Sri Lankan people by saying that the state will continue to be dominated by Sinhala Buddhists with minimal power sharing with the Tamils and Muslims. The third possibility is that the Tamil parties will use this opportunity to consolidate their demands. The Tamil parties should be vehement that removing the president or installing a Sinhala Buddhist dominated parliament is not what they want. The Tamils and Muslims have been fighting for structural change, not replacing one Buddhist leader with another. But the structural change would mean ensuring two things. One, that in any new setup, accountability includes accountability for past human rights violations, such as crimes against humanity committed during the war, which we spoke about a moment ago, and not only corruption for abuse of power and corruption as the present leader is being charged for under the economic crisis. The second is that the Tamil support in or outside parliament to the government should be predicated on serious negotiations for at least a federal system of government. Any suggestion that discussions could be postponed on this matter should be rejected or not entertained by the Tamil party. The question is whether the Tamil parties are willing to stand together to push for it. And if not, whether the numerous interest groups such as Families of the Disappeared, the diaspora, the Tamil diaspora that is, groups fighting for the release of political prisoners and for demilitarization and so on and so forth, could force the Tamil parties to stand together and make united demands. And of course, the final Gotabaya Rajapaksa abandoning political negotiations altogether and ruling with the military and its family's support, which is a pity as it will bring about further repression.
So, two of the scenarios you just described are seemingly opposing to each other. There's one in which a more pluralistic and inclusive structural change comes about that that admits or gives Tamils and Muslims more political power structurally. The other is a devolution of power to the parliament, which is controlled by a Sinhalese nationalist party. Of those two scenarios of structural change, do you find anyone more likely?
Well, I personally find the second one, that is the SJB pushing for a parliamentary form of government. If they can force Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign, a greater possibility. But it will all depend on how the Tamil parties react to that. I mean, if they stand firm and say, okay, we are not going to accept this, any sort of parliament, any sort of change to a parliamentary form of government, because it will only continue Sinhala Buddhist domination, and we can only support you if you are willing to negotiate on the two issues of greater accountability and greater power sharing. That is basically to restructure the present unitary constitution into a federal constitution, and our support will depend solely on that. If they can push that, I think they will be able to make quite a bit of it. So while I feel the parliamentary government coming about is a greater possibility if Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigns, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Tamil and Muslim party should throw up everything and say, okay, we have no other alternative but to support these guys. They definitely have the space, and I think they have the power to negotiate a better deal.
And perhaps lastly, I mean, if these protests continue and if they grow in size, what impact or do you think that might lead to one of the scenarios that you described of either Rajapaksa, doubling down with military repression or being forced to resign?
Well, I think if the protests not only at the Golf Face Promenade but other political groups such as the political parties and other interest groups like trade unions really come out and say that they will not accept any compromise and Gotabaya Rajapaksa has to go, there is a possibility of him resigning. But I don't think he will go without a fight, because he will feel that will be counterproductive, because he will face the courts of law either with Sri Lanka or possibly in a foreign country. On the other hand, he might think, okay, I have no other option but to use the military and become a dictator. And you might remember, Mark, that some time ago we had this conversation about how there's a possibility that another crisis in Sri Lanka, like the COVID-19, could bring about a recurrence of violence, because Sri Lanka's past in dealing with atrocities has not been very good. It has not gone to the root causes to resolve those issues. And if Gotabaya Rajapaksa feels that he has to sort of govern with an iron hand and by using the military, he could very well use issues like there is a very important commemorative event coming up on the 18th of March, where Tamils commemorate the dead, which traditionally Sri Lankan governments have tried to repress because they feel it's an outpouring of grief which has certain political significance and which defies the government and is a statement of dissent. So the Sri Lanka government under Gotabaya could very well use that to again, resume repression and basically say that the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Nadu and the former rebels are regrouping, and it has repressed such a possibility. All manufacture that sort of content and use that to start repression, and then spread the repression to other parts of Sri Lanka and use the military to control the country and become a full dictatorship.
And you said the 18th of March, but I think you meant the 18th of May,
18th of
right?
May. I'm sorry. Yes, 18th of May.
Okay.
That's
Well, Tissa, thank you so much. This is very helpful and timely.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for having me. Very nice speaking to you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to J.S. Tissanayagram for speaking with me. And I hope you appreciate this conversation. I know I did, and I suspect it will give you the context you need to understand events in Sri Lanka as they unfold. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.